Hi everyone, welcome back to Cybersecurity TV. So this week we're going to talk about the GraphQL and how to do the penetration test on the GraphQL APIs. So this is considered as a modern API compared to REST and SOAP. So GraphQL is being used by various developers right now, and whenever you stumble across and you don't know what to test, right, in the GraphQL. So this week I'm going to teach you not just the one main vulnerability which a GraphQL has that you need to test, but there are also quite a few things that you can do when you are coming across the GraphQL, and that is the reason now it is also included in the OWASP. So we'll also take a reference of that. Now, what is GraphQL, right? So first we need to understand. So it's an alternative API standard, just like REST and SOAP. So it's basically a query language for APIs used to interact with the APIs and to fetch data from the backend through APIs. It does everything as is what REST and SOAP does. The only thing it does in a better way, right? So it's much more efficient than the REST APIs, and we will see. I'll show you why it is much more efficient. So don't worry about that. But this is like high level. So just when we are talking about the GraphQL, just imagine it is being a query language or similar to REST APIs where you file a request, you get a response, there is no state maintained. It's not like an HTTP request, get or post. You send a query, you need X, Y, and Z, like first name, last name of this person. It gives you the first and last name of the person. That's it. We'll see plenty of examples. So what's the difference between REST and Graph? Now we established like it's similar to REST. Let's see the difference. So for example, in the REST API, let's say you need a user ID. So you will have this endpoint. Then you need username, and then you have user address. So now you have three different endpoints for this, information that you want to fetch. Now how you can simplify with GraphQL is like this. So you have this query, you have table user, you put ID, name, and address. In the response, you will get all three information. So that's how simple. So instead of having the three different endpoints, you just have like one endpoint where you fetch all the three data endpoints or information that you need, right? So this is a simple way to put it, like how the REST is different than the GraphQL. Now, last year, I believe it's the last year or earlier this year, when OWASP updated its reference, now it also included GraphQL and the other web server data layer security requirements, because it found out like a lot of people are now using GraphQL instead of REST APIs. So one of the check it makes sure is verify that query whitelisting or combination depth limiting amount should be used to prevent GraphQL or data layer expression denial of service. So we'll see the example of how the DOS can be performed with the GraphQL. The second is authorization logic should be implemented at the business logic layer instead of GraphQL layer. So we need to make sure they are doing all sort of business logic validation, authentication, authorization. We'll see the example of that as well, and few others. Now, one of the first tests you want to do when you're coming across the GraphQL is the introspection vulnerability, and it is called the introspection query. Now, simply putting what the query is, so by default, introspection query allows developers to obtain data schema. So for every MySQL database, you have a schema similar to that. It also provides you the schema details of the backend database. However, if the application does not require authentication or authorization before doing the query, an attacker can abuse this function to obtain hidden API endpoints, which providing functionality that isn't supposed to be accessible to the general public. So, all right, let me simplify this one. So suppose you're using the REST APIs, and some of the APIs are only meant for the internal people or for the admin functionality. Now you're not showing this APIs or endpoints. You're not publishing these endpoints in public documentation, but someone, if be able to figure it out, they can use this because there is no authentication or authorization, right? So similarly, it's easier. So in the GraphQL, by finding that backend, schemas and internal APIs. How we will see that in the next slide. But the main goal here is the introspection query should only be allowed internally and should not be allowed to the general public. You should disable that in the production. if you can fetch the entire backend API documentation and calls available on the server, that they can be very dangerous in many cases. What if, like, let's say deleting user is a backend API and only admin can do, but now we are exposing somehow through this introspection query, you are exposing that to the public user. So now one can use that. Even though authentication, you can also bypass authentication, like if it's implemented, but it's a bad idea to have that enabled for the public user. Suppose AWS has so many APIs, but what if they also start, like, you can figure out all the internal APIs in the public, if it's not public documentation, but you can still find out in like, by exploring some ways. That's a bad idea. Like, it should never be allowed. So how that typically happens is, so for example, let's say here's the request, right? Here's the name, friend's name. Now, instead of this, you're gonna replace that, and this is the response you're gonna get. Like, this is a sample request for the GraphQL where you get the name, you get the friend's name, and then now you need to insert the payload. So now you need to replace this request with the particular payload. Now, what the payload is, let me show that to you. Okay. So here, this is like, GraphQL.org, but you can find the same, this is very famous vulnerability, so you can find the payload anywhere. The reason I did not include the slide, because it's a very, very long payload, so I did not thought of like including that here, but I'll put the links in the description. But yeah, so here, as soon as you, like, have something like this schema, of course it's gonna give you the schema type of the backend. Now there are also so many different examples that, like, how you can replace the existing query to include something like this, and it will give you details. So you should report to the client as soon as, if you find something like this, and if you are getting the response, that means the introspection query is enabled on the backend, which should not be the case. Like, you should never be allowed to do that. The other thing is, sometimes response is, like, very long and it's very hard to read. So then there is also a parser that you can use. This is the parser for the GraphQL, which will give you like some visualized details on how this is working. Like, if you have so many backend internal APIs, then it's very hard to see sometimes. So that's why you can use this parser. You can put your response in here, and it will parse it for you, and it will give you some visualization. I'll also include this link into our description. And the third one, and the most important, is there is also a GraphQL Trader add-on by the Burp. And this also gives you good visualization, but it also helps you automate the GraphQL testing. So be sure to add this one, install this on the GraphQL if you haven't already. If you are testing, I'm sure sometime in future you'll come across testing the GraphQL. So these are, I'll include the links of all of this into our description. But yeah, this is like, how you should be parsing the response, what should be the payload to the request, and this is one of the add-on that you can use. And also, if you see, like, it has got a good rating and good reviews or popularity as well on the Burp store. Okay, let's go back. So we saw the introspection query. Now, what the other tests that you can do, right? So we saw all of this. Other tests you should always do is broken access control or insecure direct object reference, IDOR. Now, broken access control on GraphQL-based application is the most often flaw. While GraphQL helps implement proper data validation, APIs developers are left on their own to implement authentication and authorization methods on top. So that's why I'll show you the example how it can be done. But imagine, like, you have the SQL query. Now, query itself does not validate whether the user is authenticated or not, right? It's possible that the user is firing the query, but the user does not have rights. Now, there's no way MySQL would know whether it has the rights or not. So you need to implement the access control at the top layer to make sure before even someone can fire the query, whether they should have access to the query or not. But this is very common flaw across GraphQL because sometimes developers miss that, and they allow access to all the queries irrespective of authentication. So first off, as I said, that there could be two types of attacks. One is the access control, and the other one is insecure direct object reference. Now, insecure direct object reference is sometimes you find the internal query, you directly type that query, and then you get the response, right? That's in the OWASP top 10. Access control is something like you are only allowed to see the data of user ID 1, first and last name, but now if you include the password in that, you're also getting the response as a password. Now, if you change ID to 2, you are getting details of the other user in the response. That's a combination of access control or indirect object reference, right? Now attacker can perform some malicious action without authorization. And now, if you are exposing, let's say, change password or other APIs, now attacker can also use that. That's an indirect object reference. I'm not going to go in detail what the indirect object reference is, but that you can find in the OWASP top 10. I'll cover in the separate video. All right, task 3. So here we're going to talk about the DAOs. So one of the OWASP requests that we saw was the DAOs and access control and all those things. So this is one of that. So instead of asking legitimate useful data, a malicious actor could submit an expensive nested query to all of your servers, database, network, or all of this. Without the right protection, you open up yourself up to the DAOs attack. So sometimes, some queries you should ask for OTP or MFA. Now, if that's missing, and you're not doing any validation, an attacker can type whatever they want, then it could include the DAOs. So let's say this is the original request, right? Where you're typing when you're requesting some messages, and it will give you the response. Now, suppose we are doing the malicious query, where we are just nesting it. We are typing the nesting query 10,000 or million times. It's easy to do it with the automated tools like Burp or some scripts. And if you're not able to detect this, your backend will be completely screwed, or it will not be able to respond. So that's why it's not a good idea to miss any validation. So try this out whenever you're doing the GraphQL pen test. Try this out definitely to see if they have throttling in place or not. All right, and last test you always want to do is SQL or NoSQL injection. Since the GraphQL is just a middle layer between the application and the database, then the SQL and NoSQL injection is still possible. The problem may reside in the layer developed to fetch variables from GraphQL queries in order to interrogate the database. Variables that are not properly sanitized lead to simple SQL injection, right? So sometimes it is possible that it's using SQL in the backend or NoSQL in the backend, and if it's not doing the input validation, now this can be easily automated using the Burp suite, so you don't need to worry about. But something you definitely want to try. Now, prevention technique we pretty much talked about, but let's quickly recap. So disable the introspection option or list require authentication to use the introspection query, right? Because that's not should be allowed for the public users or in production. Make sure you have the authentication to use specific action. And the reason we are passing more authentication because sometimes developers take it for granted. Yes, because the user is authenticated on at the authentication layer, now they can use everything. But sometimes these queries or APIs, for example, REST APIs, if it does not require the session token or bearer token, then someone can easily request the endpoint and get the response. So similarly, you need to have the authentication for each API. All the sensitive resources need to be reviewed their accessibility. Only allow the resources that you believe the public user should have access to. Otherwise, do not allow it. So you can put all this recommendation in your pentest report whenever you're testing the GraphQL. And all user input must be sanitized. Of course, similar to SQL, NoSQL injection. Apply size limit, allow listing query. So make sure no one can do like a DOS attack or something like that. on your web server. Make sure you have throttling enabled, or developers have throttling enabled. So I'm very excited about this video because more and more applications are coming up and using the GraphQL, and wanted to let you guys know that what are the type of tasks that you can do with the GraphQL. Of course, if you have any other tasks that you have done in the past, or you know the good reference, please share with me. I'll be happy to learn something new as well in the comment section below. Also, will help our community to learn something new. Let me know if you have any other questions on this one. I'll put all the links in the description. Be sure to thumbs up the video if you like this video, and subscribe. And also follow us on Facebook, where we post interesting posts and updates to the weekly episodes. That's it for this week. I'll see you guys next week.